Welcome to a lunch lecture on the future of democracy in Europe. My name is Clemens Sedmak and I serve as director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies here at Notre Dame's Keough School of Global Affairs. I met a person this morning who said, today is not St. Patrick's Day. And I said, this is Notre Dame, every day is St. Patrick's Day. Anyway, we have a lecture on the future of democracy in Europe. The lecture, no lecture without a lecturer. We welcome Ambassador Mark Gitenstein, who will be introduced by my colleague Joel Day momentarily, and also Ambassador's wife, Libby. Welcome, Mark and Libby. That was good. So, lecture on the future of democracy in Europe, lecture. The future is you, the wonderful audience. Welcome. May the lecture strengthen your desire to be and become artisans of a new humanity, because that's what we need. Democracy. This is Notre Dame's Democracy Initiative. The Democracy Initiative is co-sponsoring this event and is represented by its managing director, Joel Day, whom I will introduce in a minute. Welcome, Joel. Good. And Europe, this is the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. The Nanovic Institute is committed to bridge building, bridges between Notre Dame and Europe and between Europe and Notre Dame. One of our initiatives is a program in diplomacy, where we bring diplomats to campus to engage with our students. Ambassador Gitenstein is our diplomat in residence in spring 2025. He contributes to our course, Deep Dive into Diplomacy, and advises students with an interest in foreign affairs. Today, he's our Nanovic Forum speaker. The Nanovic Forum was established through the generosity of our wonderful founding benefactors, Bob and Liz Nanovic. It serves the purpose of bringing important voices who can speak to European matters to campus. Ambassador Gitenstein is such an important voice. There are places in the front row for those who like to sit in the front row. Ambassador Gitenstein is such an important voice. And because the ambassador is important, he will be introduced by Dr. Joel Day, Managing Director of Notre Dame's Democracy Initiative. Joel Day is a native speaker, so you will have no problems understanding him. He holds a PhD in International and Comparative Politics from the University of Denver Corbett School of International Studies. After his PhD, he worked as a scholar practitioner in the fields of government, non-profits, and political campaigns. He has done research on political violence, democratic pluralism, and religious ideology. He previously served as department director at the city of San Diego, where he oversaw several public safety initiatives. In 2020, he was appointed senior advisor for COVID-19 response and recovery. If you remember the dark times of the pandemic, you may agree that a person who could weather this storm is ready for anything, including being prepared to run a democracy initiative in a Catholic university. That's a little bit of a joke, but anyway, I'm not going there. Joel most recently held the position of Senior Fellow and Director of Research at Princeton University's Bridging Divides Initiative, where he worked to count and counter events of political violence in the US. I hope more counting than countering. Dr. Day has held academic appointments at the University of Southern California and the University of California, San Diego. And now he's in Notre Dame, and right now he's in the room, and at this very moment he will introduce our Nanovic Forum speaker. Thank you, Joel.
Now I'm going to read your CV for everyone. Well, thank you very much for co-sponsoring this with the Democracy Initiative. So to all of you, on behalf of the Provost and of Professor Dave Campbell, myself, I'd like to welcome you. I'd like to welcome you, Ambassador. Thank you so much for being here for this important conversation. The Democracy Initiative works with institutes like Nanovic on campus throughout our entire university to hold what we're calling democracy talks that are both timely and accessible talks to the whole campus community, meaning you don't have to have a degree in econometrics or international politics in order to understand and engage. For example, the upcoming talks in April are going to have democracy talks with the law school with two lead prosecutors in the United States versus Donald Trump, lawyers who President Trump fired in his first days in office. We will also have Ambassador Chris Liu here in April with the Keough School speaking on why the world needs U.S. democracy. Today's speaker is one of the most foremost practitioners of global affairs, so it's appropriate that the Keough School and Nanovic invite him. We are so lucky to have you, Ambassador, here. While there is no doubt that the invite letter would have eventually found itself in his email, it helped that his daughter happens to be my neighbor. While our kids were playing in the park together a couple of months ago, Sarah casually mentioned to me her last name, and I immediately began texting Clemens, hey, we need to get the ambassador here. Ambassador Mark Gitenstein served as U.S. ambassador to the European Union from 2002 to 2025. He represented the U.S. on issues like trade and technology regulation, and most recently, a critical, important voice in Russia's attack on Ukraine. Gitenstein served as U.S. ambassador to Romania from 2009 to 2012. He was awarded the Star of Romania, the nation's highest civilian honor, by the President of Romania in 2012. He began his career with 17 years of service in the United States Senate, including as chief counsel to the Judiciary Committee and the United States Senate Intelligence Committee. He and I were texting just yesterday on Signal about that experience. In addition to his service with President Biden for 13 years in the Senate, he co-chaired the then senator's transition to the vice presidency in 2008 and helped set up his transition to the presidency in 2020. Ambassador, we are eager to hear your thoughts on the future of democracy in Europe.
Oh, thank you, Clemens. Thank you. Oh, let me turn my microphone on here. No, I have this one. This is so I can walk around. Hopefully there'll be no feedback here. Thank you, Clemens, for your enthusiastic speech and introduction. Same to Joel and to my wife and daughter. But for them, I wouldn't be here today, and all sorts of reasons. So thanks for having me. I'll get right into it here. I'd like to begin with a few personal stories. I grew up during the Cold War. I can still remember as a freshman in high school in 1961 watching that small black and white television as President Kennedy delivered his inaugural address. And in his words, "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we will pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty." In other words, democracy in Europe. As ambassador to the European Union and to Romania, I thought of myself as serving that cause. So it is particularly disturbing to me that anyone would even question the need to address today's topic, the future of democracy in Europe. Almost 81 years ago, after the D-Day landings in Normandy, why would there be any question about democracy in Europe? I'm sad to say it's a very salient question, because the fact is that democracy in Europe is in jeopardy. So is the transatlantic alliance, and therefore our national security. Now, there are foreign policy experts with much greater credentials than mine who have written thousands of words on these topics on the editorial pages of the nation's newspapers and foreign policy journals in recent weeks. I can't match Tom Friedman, David Ignatius, Fareed Zakaria, Ann Applebaum. Just go Google them and you can read their columns. I will just speak from my personal experience and from the heart. 2 years ago, on the 79th anniversary of D-Day, my wife, Libby, and I visited the cliffs of Normandy. We stood on Pont de Hoc, where courageous American GIs clawed their way up the sheer face of terror to silent German guns aimed at our landing craft. And we stood in the sands of Iwo Jima Beach, so vividly captured in the movie Saving Private Ryan. On that cliff, I remember turning to Livy and asking, what gave these young men the courage to grapple their way up that cliff with Germans firing down on them with machine guns? On the 40th anniversary of D-Day, on that very cliff, Ronald Reagan, in one of his greatest speeches, told us why. In his words, the men of Normandy had faith that what they were doing was right, faith that they fought for all humanity, faith that a just God would grant them mercy on this beachhead. And then Reagan turned to a couple of aging veterans and said, you are here to liberate, not to conquer. One's country is worth dying for. Democracy is worth dying for. Reagan then goes on to explain that when the war was over, in his words, there were lives to be rebuilt in Europe and governments to be returned to the people. The Marshall Plan, NATO, the European Union were created. Huge, complicated, multilateral institutions, the primary purpose of which was to rebuild democracy and free markets. A project that was for the benefit of the American people and their national security. And what to me is the most important paragraph in that speech, especially for today, he reminded us, in his words, we in America have learned bitter lessons from 2 world wars. It is better to be here, ready to protect the peace, than to take blind shelter across the sea, rushing to respond only after freedom is lost. We've learned that isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments with an expansionist intent. Might add, little known fact, more GIs, American GIs, have died in Europe than anywhere else in the world. In the last year of his presidency in 1988, Ronald Reagan reiterated this point in another eloquent speech, quote, the Atlantic Alliance is the core of American foreign policy and security. Preservation of a free and democratic Europe is essential to preservation of peaceful, free, and democratic United States. President Biden, in his last weeks in office, addressed these same themes in several speeches. And in what I believe to be his greatest speech of his presidency, his farewell address, spoke to the threat to our democracy. He warned, quote, a dangerous cancer, dangerous concentration of power in the hands of very few ultra-wealthy people, and the dangerous consequences if the abuse of power is left unchecked. An oligarchy is taking shape in America of extreme wealth, power, and influence that literally threatens our entire democracy, our basic rights and freedoms, and a fair shot for everyone to get ahead. He was speaking of threats here in the United States, but having discussed this recently with President Biden, I know that he agrees with me that the threat is equally present in Europe as well, and as it is in some significant measure fostered by Russia. This is a repeat of what Hitler was doing in the 1930s. At that very moment, an isolationist movement called America First, led in part by Charles Lindbergh, attempted to convince Americans it was not their problem. If Putin's Russia and what he is attempting to do in Ukraine is not what Reagan called a tyrannical government with an expansionist intent, quite frankly, I don't know what is. I'm going to make the case that democracy is in danger in Europe by focusing on 2 countries that are near and dear to my heart, Moldova and Romania. And I will draw your attention to the very mechanics of democracy, voting. First, let me remind you about President Biden's warning about the insidious influence of disinformation on social media. His comments apply in shocking detail in Europe in these two countries. Unsurprisingly, this past year, Russia has deliberately intervened in recent elections in Romania and Moldova. Not only was I U.S. ambassador to Romania between 2009 and 12, but my ancestors were from Moldova and Romania. So both countries have a very special place in my heart. As U.S. ambassador to the EU from 22 to 25, I followed the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its aftermath as part of my work every day as the U.S. and the EU worked together to hold Russians accountable. I was not surprised to see the Russians attempt to thwart Moldova's aspirations to join the EU and to neutralize Romania. Let's start with Moldova. Maya Sandu has been the president of Moldova since 2020 and has skillfully led the country in a pro-European democracy direction ever since. In June of last year, the EU granted Moldova candidate status to join the Union. Defeating her re-election in October, along with a referendum on preserving Moldovan European path, were Russian priorities. According to the Moldovan security services, in local elections in 23, the Russians had spent more than $50 million on illegal financing. By the way, that's in a country of about 3 million people. President Sandu was the target of deep fakes portraying her as pro-Russian or making offensive comments to certain ethnic groups. In the October elections this past year, according to one expert, the Russians recruited Ilan Shor, a pro-Russian oligarch subject to U.S. sanctions, to lead a comprehensive disruption campaign, including, this is from the report, quote, outright buying of votes, cyber attacks, planned espionage at diaspora polling stations. And according to Amelia Benjamin of the McCain Institute, this included manipulation of false Facebook accounts and pouring, quote, huge amounts of money into ordinary Moldovan citizens' bank accounts to buy their votes. Now, the U.S. and the EU committed significant resources to counter the Russians. Independent polling suggested that President Sandu would win convincingly, and so would the referendum. But she barely made it past the first round, did win in the end in a runoff. However, the referendum only passed by 50.4%. Romania. A month later, the Russians tried their hand in Romania with greater success. Now, the president of Romania is charged with national security functions under the Romanian Constitution and represents Romania in the European Council, where unanimity is required for all foreign policy decisions, like on Ukraine. Calin Georgescu was a largely unknown ultra-nationalist, pro-Russian extremist when the election for president took place in November. A few weeks before the election, he barely registered in the polls, but on election day, he led the first round with 20%. Installing a pro-Russian president would be a genuine threat to the transatlantic alliance. Romania was already planning to host 10,000 NATO troops and housed a major NATO anti-missile site that the Russians vehemently opposed. Georgescu agreed with the Russians. The role of social media immediately became suspect. Georgescu claimed to have raised and spent no campaign money. Soon after the elections, the Romanian intelligence services released redacted intel documents revealing foreign meddling, and along with other sources, that someone mysteriously allegedly spent $1 million in the 18 months before the election on TikTok. Romania asked the EU to use its authority under the Digital Services Act, known as the DSA, to investigate the role of TikTok. One issue it will clearly investigate is how Georgescu managed to get 370,000 supporters in just a few weeks, out of nowhere. Reuters, on November 4th, elaborated on the declassified documents. Romania was the subject of, quote, aggressive hybrid Russian attacks. And according to Romanian intelligence services, Georgescu was massively promoted on social media platform TikTok through coordinated accounts, recommendation algorithms, and paid promotion. On December 6, Romania's highest court annulled the election, which has been rescheduled for May. The EU will report shortly on its findings, and the Romanian government is conducting its own investigation of potential campaign finance violations. Based in part, I presume, on these investigations, the Romanian Bureau of Elections disqualified Georgescu from becoming a candidate. Hopefully, both the EU and the Romanian authorities will make public to the voters the results of these investigations before the election in May. I addressed this issue in detail in a conference at the University of Pennsylvania in February on Russian disinformation and election meddling. At the conference, I gave specific ideas on how this could be remedied by the EU and the US, and I'd be happy to elaborate if you're interested in the Q&A period. What is important for you to understand is that these are just two examples in Europe of threats to democracy orchestrated in part by the Russians. Place this in the context of at least 4 other EU member states where there is a serious backsliding on democratic values. In each case, there is a toxic combination of profound dissatisfaction with the ruling regimes, weakened institutions, Euroscepticism, and deliberate Russian meddling. The consequences are a marked deterioration of unity in the EU and NATO, where major national security issues, again, Ukraine, are decided by unanimous vote. Russian agenda is very obvious. They only need 1 vote. This is true in NATO and the EU. So what should we make of this? I have 3 generic points. First, it will not surprise you that I still believe that what I have been fighting for in the last 15 years working in Central and Eastern Europe, the preservation of democracy and the rule of law, is America's fight. The 4 freedoms, the Atlantic Charter, the Truman Doctrine, the bipartisan consensus, the importance of Atlanticism, through Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon to the present, are very much alive for me. Although I have profound differences with the current administration, I do agree that the Europeans in NATO and the EU need to carry more of the burden. In fact, that has been the policy of the United States for decades, and in particular in the last administration. In a perverse way, one good consequence of all of this is that the Europeans will finally step up. I certainly hope so. But especially in foreign policy, the way reform is conducted is critically important. Predictability, reason, respect for your allies are critical part of the playbook. One of the most eloquent explanations of this approach was expressed by one of my favorite New York Times columnists, David French. As he puts it, if agreements are subject to immediate revocation with the advent of a new administration, will any sensible world power rely on America's word or America itself? To be clear, French sees the need for change, but lasting change must be undertaken with deliberation and caution. He talks about his favorite British writer, Catholic philosopher G.K. Chesterton. He tells the story of the so-called Chesterton fence to illustrate his point. Why does this fence block this road, the reformer asks. Chesterton continues, quote, "The more modern type of reformer goes gaily up to the fence and says, 'I don't see the use of this. Let's get rid of it.' To which the more intelligent type reformer will do well to answer, 'If you don't see the use of it, I certainly won't let you clear it away. Go away and think. Then when you can come back and tell me that you do see a use for it, I will allow you to destroy it.' These institutions have value, but still need to be reformed. French and I are institutionalists. When you blithely destroy institutions, you destroy trust and the underpinning of democracy. On the eve of my first day at law school, many, many years ago, at another great Catholic institution, Georgetown, all of us newbies were instructed to watch the classic movie, A Man for All Seasons, the story of probably the greatest Catholic lawyer, Sir Thomas More. In a scene which animated my approach to law for the rest of my career, More gets into an argument with his daughter's new fiancé, a fledgling and impetuous new lawyer, William Roper. Roper is appalled when More admits he would give the devil the benefit of the protections of the law. More: "Yes, what would you do? Cut a great road through the law to get at the devil?" Roper: "Yes, I'd cut down every law in England to do that." More responds firmly, "Oh, and when the last law was down and the devil turned around on you, where would you hide, the laws all being flat? This country is planted thick with laws, from coast to coast, man's laws, not God's. And if you cut them down and you are the man to do it, do you really think you could stand upright in the winds that would flow then? Yes, I'd give the devil the benefit of law for my own safety's sake." The point is, these complicated multilateral institutions, NATO, EU, the IMF, the World Bank, USAID, the State Department, are frustrating, complicated, at times infuriating institutions. Indeed, as Churchill liked to say, that applies to democracy itself. But if we tear them all down, can we stand upright on our own in the winds that will follow? So, as an institution, I plead for caution and proceed on reform with all deliberate speed. Second, as a proud member of the Biden foreign policy team, we had one significant failure. As I have said recently at the highest reaches of the Biden administration, our greatest failure in this realm is that we have not engaged the American people on the importance of the transatlantic alliance. Ronald Reagan clearly understood in his bones and said as much, that without democracy on one side of the Atlantic, there won't be democracy on the other, and that it's important for all Americans. It should be important not just to the elites who read the editorial page of the New York Times, but to the average Americans who work every day to pay the bills. When only 70% of college graduates in 2014 even knew that D-Day occurred in World War II, it's not surprising that Americans equivocate on protecting democracy in Europe. To say the least, those of us who agree with Reagan that the transatlantic alliance is the cornerstone of our foreign policy have a lot of work to do. Third, we have to return to first principles about saving democracy on both sides of the Atlantic. So now to my favorite subject, the importance of free and independent media as the essential bulwark of democracy, especially in Europe. Propaganda, hysteria, and especially disinformation on social media seem to be driving decision-making in Europe, especially in elections. The environment is absolutely toxic in almost all the member states of the EU where democracy is backsliding. Countering disinformation should be focused on one simple truth, as a recent Carnegie study points out. One institution that can make a real difference is a strong, resilient, independent press. The best answer to disinformation is more truthful information that points out the lies. But as President Biden said in his farewell address, in the face of the threat of oligarchy here in Europe, the free press is crumbling. With the current approach to the Trump foreign policy, the tradition of FDR and the Four Freedoms or Reagan and the shining city on a hill may be over for now. It's our job to keep those bedrock principles alive, especially as they relate to free and independent media. As in the US, as the Medill Journalism School at Northwestern points out, there are huge news deserts where local journalism is literally dead. Similar deserts exist in the EU, as a recent EU study shows. But the biggest problem in Europe is captured media. By that I mean independent media co-opted by the autocratic regimes. Crumbling media on both sides of the Atlantic is also a market failure, as business models for legacy media are failing. It's the reason that independent media are vulnerable to buyouts by oligarchs like Orban in Hungary, who upon his election in 2010 simply gathered up all his friends and they went out and bought most of the independent media in Hungary. The experts speak of this co-option in the context of the deterioration of what they call media plurality. In the case of our two studies, Moldova and Romania, media plurality is under siege. Reporters Without Borders, RBC, measures media pluralism throughout Europe every year. According to RBC, the results for both countries are better than Hungary, but still very disturbing. For example, the narrative on Moldova is the Ilan Shor, remember him? I mentioned him earlier, is the pro-Kremlin oligarch behind the Russian meddling scheme, still controls a significant media empire in Moldova, despite partially successful efforts by the Sandu government to break the monopoly. In Romania, according to the RBC, media funding mechanisms are often opaque, even corrupt. Yet, it was a hardy group of independent journalists at thinly resourced digital platforms in Romania that forced the government to declassify the TikTok documents. Now, while I was ambassador in Brussels, our mission spent a lot of time and energy on this problem. I spoke of it in my closing remarks in a forum hosted by Politico Europe. You can look it up on YouTube. One of the most sustainable and reliable strategies for preserving and enhancing independent media is the private sector. As recent events demonstrate, we obviously can't depend on USAID, although they did become involved in preserving independent media in Europe. The basic message is that the EU needs to treat independent media like we are treating electric vehicles, a market failure. We need to convince the EU to create risk mitigating regimes, subsidies, tax credits, to encourage equity investors to place safer bets on independent media. This problem and its solution are beyond the scope of this lecture, but it will be part of a project I hope to convince the Nanovic Institute here at Notre Dame to focus on. Nothing less than our democracy and the stability of the Atlantic Alliance are at stake. Thanks for listening. I'd be happy to take your questions.
So I'm going to moderate our conversation today with the ambassador. We have a mic that is going to be roving around with Clemens. And I will call on students or prioritize students when I see their hands.
Even if you don't see their hands.
Even if I don't see their hands, I will call you out by name. Chair's prerogative then, as you think about your questions. Ambassador, my question is, you mentioned a little bit around other threats besides what's happening in Romania and Moldova. Hungary was one that you mentioned, but there's a host of other places that had elections this past year.
Right.
A handful that elected populist right-wing governments in EU elections. And how did you, as ambassador of the EU, grapple with a surge of candidates coming into the EU Parliament that were explicitly about pulling those countries back from the EU? And to your point around oligarchy, what was your comment or concern about American interests and global owners of capital and technology funding those campaigns with a surge of capital?
Well, let's talk about the European Union is an extremely complicated institution, but it has a parliament, by the way, 700 members of that parliament, popularly elected throughout Europe. And the elections you're referring to, I think, took place in June, okay? There was much back and forth by the media about the rise of the hard right in that parliament, but the fact is the center-right still won those elections. The Christian Democrats, known as the People's Party, basically, European People's Party, still controls the parliament, and the current president of the Commission who was, by the way, one of the great leaders of the world right now, Ursula von der Leyen, was reelected as president of the Commission. There was more stability than there was change. Now, the hard right did gain seats in the parliament. They still are not represented in the leadership, in effect, and the center right, which is very pro-Western, pro-American, continues to run the parliament, and the president of the parliament, Libby and I had lunch with her before we left, very much shares our values. So I didn't see a big change there. In terms of funding those elections, there could well have been funding. There was certainly tacit support by some of the hard right. But the fact is, I mean, you probably were referring to what happened in Germany. Those were not European elections. Those were actually German elections. The hard right, the AfD, I think it's called, did gain seats, but they did not. I'm not sure they even made it into a ruling position in the Bundestag. I mean, Friedrich Merz, who is the new Chancellor of Germany, is center-right, same party as the European People's Party. So it's more alike than it is, it's more the same than it is different. Now, you know, is it having an impact? Yes. And I think, to be frank, the Trump administration's approach to Europe is having an impact. So all of these things working together are issues of concern to me.
Okay, we have a question right down here.
Thank you so much for coming in to speak to us.
Yeah.
So I have a question about what should relations with Russia look like in a scenario when the war in Ukraine does end? How do we is it like continued deterrence, or does it have to turn towards more rapprochement with Russia? And do you think that the EU as an institution has just ingrained too much anti-Russian sentiment by now that like diplomacy with them is never even going to be possible again?
Do we want to do line up a couple of questions, or let me just do one at a time, because that's a very, very excellent question. I'm optimistic about the European Union. I find it to be a complicated but very resilient institution, very much underestimated by Americans and Russians, by the way. Its role in helping us take on the biggest threat to our national security now, the People's Republic of China. And I think we'll continue, if we continue to work with them, have a very positive impact on our national security as well. I would not characterize the European position as totally hostile to Russia. There are a number of member states in the European Union that are willing to see a rapprochement with Russia. I mean, a good example is Italy, okay, which is harder right probably than most of the rest of Europe. But Meloni, who is the prime minister of in Italy, is a very pragmatic advocate for Ukraine and skeptical of Russia. I think they would like any of us, would like to see this war over, but on the terms in which the Biden administration and bipartisan coalition in the Congress support it, which is that, you know, we'll welcome Russia back into the community of nations, but it's under the community of nations rules, not their rules. Just as concerned about what Ronald Reagan saw 80 years ago, a tyrannical regime that sinks to build an empire, that is not sustainable in Europe, because the people who will suffer the most are the Europeans. They do not believe that if there's a settlement in Ukraine that Putin will stop at the Prut River, okay? They don't believe that, and they're right. And I think in the end, the Europeans will develop, with our help, hopefully our leadership, a pro-Western or Western united approach to Russia, which does not involve a total capitulation. It's not sustainable. And the people that advocate that haven't spent enough time in Ukraine or Romania, for example. I was talking to a friend of mine on the phone the other day about what are Ukrainians' attitudes towards the Russians. It's not that different from the Romanians. They've lived under Russian rule. And I remember very vividly, and I'll close with this story, when the war started, I got to Brussels on January 19th. The war started on the 24th. As Libby will tell you, I watch CNN every morning over breakfast. And CNN in Europe is very vivid. And it's the coverage is very extensive. And every time a bomb hit a maternity center, and you saw, you know, young women carry their babies out of the hospital, or the most dramatic moment, Sarah, this reminded me of you. I watched Clarissa Ward, many of you have seen her on CNN, interview a young woman with her young child, looked like Charlie, in her arms. And she's in tears. And Clarissa Ward says, they're in the subway in Kharkiv. It was the only safe place to be because there was bombs coming down. And she's holding her child. And Clarissa Ward says to the young mother, your child's going to be safe. And she says, I'm not crying about that. She says, what are you crying? She says, I don't want to live in Russia. Most Ukrainians do not want to live in Russia. And the anger is very deep. And I'll tell you the last story this young activist in Romania told me, because Romanians feel the same way. She said, Mark, don't forget the story of the grandmother in Ukraine who was handing out cookies to the Russian soldiers, who, by the way, were beasts, okay? You know the story of Bucha. And this was in Bucha. Handing out cookies to them. You know the cookies? They were poisoned. She was trying to kill those soldiers because she hates them. Now, if you think any combination of American politicians can convince Ukrainians that they will be happy under Russian rule, think again.
So we have a few hands here, 1, 2, and 3. And Ambassador, can I have you actually stand by the mic?
Okay. Oh, you can't hear my mic?
Well, it's a little bit more muted than that one.
Okay.
For the,
all right. I'm sorry. I'm sort of a restless type, so I move around a lot.
Thank you so much. My question is about isolationism, which you mentioned
Yeah,
at the beginning of your talk,
yeah.
not being a proper response, and wondering if you see a parallel between isolationism as kind of a foreign policy approach and also the isolationism or bubbling effect within social media when we have disinformation algorithms that try to make us each live in a separate reality.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you see connections between these two and also connections in the ways that we can move beyond that to something better. Thank you.
Well, you've reminded me of something I'm very focused on right now, which is the role of these big tech companies in influencing democracy and voting all over the world, but particularly in Europe right now. And I would encourage you to read a book. It's very, very negative and jarring. It's called Careless People. It's a story of a young New Zealand diplomat who becomes a close aide to Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. And it's a very disturbing story. It's something I was suspected, but I didn't, I think it's what Biden was talking about in his speech. And that is that the business model of big tech is in effect running into our democracy. Because the way Facebook and a number of other big tech companies make money, especially on social media, is by using their algorithm to continue to increase the number of eyeballs. And the book tells the story of what happened when they did the IPO of Facebook. They had a billion users then, and in order to keep the stock price up, they had to continue to increase the number of users. Well, the most reliable way to continue to increase eyeballs, unfortunately, is through the algorithm by getting people who are like-minded to you to also open a new Facebook account. Now, unfortunately, that infects the whole social media regime, TikTok, Telegram, X. And as long as that's happening, it's basically become a propaganda regime, a disinformation regime, and that is extremely dangerous. Now, to be fair to the J.D. Vances and the Elon Musks of the world who criticize what the DSA does or what Romania does, it is a serious freedom of press issue. How do you deal with that? And I can talk more about that if people are interested. The DSA is actually a pretty good regime for doing that, but we're going to have to come to grips with that, or our democracy simply won't survive on either sides of the Atlantic. And the only last point I would make on technology is, and I've spent a lot of time on this in the United States, one of my best friends is the publisher of the Seattle Times, who's a big advocate of saving local media. Technology companies have destroyed the business model for legacy media because the revenue base is gone. The revenue base has migrated to social media. Most people in this country increasingly are relying on social media for news, not legacy media. And that, we have to find a way to save that.
Thank you for coming, Ambassador. So when we're talking about this idea of democracy, I think it's obviously a great goal for the U.S. government to try to protect this and kind of spread democracy. But what exactly do we mean by the term democracy? And then also, has the U.S. government ever undermined democracy in other, like, foreign governments?
No. The answer to your last question is definitely yes. Little known fact about my history is I was on the church committee staff that investigated what the FBI and the CIA were doing, both domestically and in foreign policy, throughout the 60s, even 50s and 60s, and it's a very disturbing story. And as a matter of fact, the CIA was undermining democracy in the rest of the world, and the FBI was doing a pretty damn good job here, doing that very same thing. If you're interested, we can talk about what they did to Dr. King. It's pretty appalling. Now, when I say save democracy, I'm not simply talking about saving majority vote, because Viktor Orban is elected with a majority vote. Vladimir Putin is elected with a majority vote. That's not the issue. It goes back to Benjamin Franklin's favorite aphorism when he walks out of the convention. You know, the famous story in Philadelphia when he walks out and a woman walks up to him and said, "What kind of government have you created?" And he says, "A republic, if you can keep it." He didn't say a democracy, he said a republic. Now, what is a republic? I'll let my philosophers elaborate if they want, but to me, a republic is a democracy subject to the rule of law and to a constitution and to consensus rules that protect the rights of minorities and protect the enforceability of law, protect the right to contract, protect private property. These are all things that if you had a majority vote might not survive. Certainly the First Amendment wouldn't survive. So that's what I mean by protecting democracy. Hard lesson for Romanians to understand. They used to argue with me all the time about this. when I would say, they were treating Roma poorly or they were undermining the freedom of speech in Romania, they would say, well, it's a majority vote. And who the heck is the European Union to come in and tell us that we can't do this or that? And I said, you're members of the European Union. You're subject to their rules. This is where my background growing up in Alabama made a difference. It's no difference than John Kennedy calling up, which some of you may remember, President Kennedy calling up George Wallace, one of the great autocrats of the world, and telling him, no, you will comply with the 14th Amendment. You will not discriminate against black people, and you will allow people, anybody of any color, to go to the University of Alabama. It's no different. It's the same notion.
Thank you. My name is Urszula Soler. I'm a sociologist, professor of the John Paul II Catholic University in Lublin, in Poland. Mm-hmm. And I have to say that your lecture created a lot of emotions and a lot of thoughts in me, because I live in different reality than you live here. Mm-hmm. And I'm working mostly with cybersecurity and disinformation particularly. For many years, we are dealing with Russian disinformations in Europe, and we deal with it, especially in Poland. And as an example, which I can give you, 2-3 years before a Russian invasion in Ukraine, we started to observe a huge disinformation attack on Polish social media about Wołyń massacre. It was a massacre that happened in 1943 by Ukrainians on Poles in Ukraine. And at the beginning, we didn't understand what was going on, why it was so extensive, why it was so important, why there were so many emotions in that. But after we understood that Russia was preparing the full-scale invasion at the Ukraine, and they were trying to make us Poles against Ukrainians to close our border, not to let them enter when they will attack. So we live in this situation for many, many years, and we are trying to understand, to research what to do with that. I would like to give a comment about independent television, that you said that maybe one of the solution will be to make independent media private. In last month, we had this situation in Poland that one of our private television, which is TVN, which is pro-American with American capital, was at the market, and Orban's co-workers, Hungarian, pro-Russian, were trying to buy it. So at the end, for us, it wouldn't be the solution, because it became like a Russian vision again in our private television. But there are many concerns we could discuss it about for years. But my question is, because Poland is in this geopolitical situation that was a bit complicated between two great, strong countries, which is Germany and Russia. And our eyes, at the moment, my eyes are also on Germany, because we see that it's becoming a pretty strong crisis there. So I would like to ask you, what do you think about the situation in Germany? And if we, I mean European Union, but also United States, what we could do to help them to fight with this crisis, which could be dangerous, not only for Europe, but to whole country, forward, sorry.
Well, let me respond first to your first point. It concerns me about if you have independent private sector purchases, who it is. And I think there is a role for the government to play in monitoring certainly foreign influence. I mean, if a Putin oligarch buddy buys TVN, for example, that will not be a good thing. By the way, there's a huge crisis going on with Warner Discovery right now because it's up for sale. The problem with television, by the way, is extremely expensive. Okay, so only people with a lot of money can buy television, although ironically, digital media, which can have a huge impact, is not a very expensive investment. There's a lot going on in that space. We can talk about it afterwards. Now, your second question was about Germany. I think the problem that we have now, and you saw a little bit in the so-called Signalgate crisis that occurred in the last few days, with the thing that disturbed me the most in that transcript, which was in the New York Times today, you know what I'm talking about, was the hostility to Europe. You know, it's palpable, and it's wrong. And it doesn't make it easy for somebody like Friedrich Merz, who is trying to build a pro-Western. I know Friedrich Merz. He was a law partner of mine. He's a very talented guy. He's the new chancellor of Germany, trying to build a pro-Western, if not pro-American, alliance that would be a good counter to the AfD. Okay, but he's got to produce results. You know, the German auto industry is in free fall right now, and if unemployment and inflation again become hot political issues, that's just the kind of toxic environment in which the hard right flourishes. And so America and a pro-European foreign policy is critical to keep that from happening, or we'll be back in the soup again. We'll have American troops here before it's over. We've done that twice. I fear we'd do it again if we don't get ahead of it. That's what Reagan meant. Get ahead of this. Don't wait for the war to start. Don't wait for an 800-mile wall to be built on the Atlantic.
This is my concern, yes.
Excuse me?
This is my concern.
Yeah, well, it's a very legitimate one. Yeah.
We are coming up against time. I want to recognize as many people as we can in this.
Yeah.
We're coming up against time. I want to recognize as many people as we can. So I'm going to try to take 3 questions very quickly in a row, and then you can sort of give closing remarks in response.
Okay, and by the way, I'm happy after people break up, we can
That
sit
sounds
in the
great.
corner and talk.
So over here, and over here, and over here, and then we'll close.
Thank you, Ambassador. I was just wondering, aside from like asking other NATO countries aside from the U.S. to kind of put a little bit more into their own like defense and into NATO, what other reformations for like NATO do you think would be good to do in the future, especially like the very near future? Because if I'm not mistaken, you brought that one up, and I agree with that. But are there any others that you think would be necessary or good to do? Thank you.
I have some. Why don't we do the 3 questions, then I'll pull them all together.
There has been, along with the increase in military spendings or plan to increase military spending throughout Europe, there's been a general reluctance to debt finance that spending. Even though you see in Germany the lifting of the debt cap there, still elsewhere you're seeing a reluctance. Should we be concerned about the desire to pull back spending elsewhere in the economy for military spending when it comes to moving away from spending on services? Should we worry about any backlash there?
Thank you. And as my question as a British citizen, I was wondering if you could share your perspective on the role of the UK in many of these discussions in securing democracy in Europe as a country which is in Europe but outside the European Union and which has recently elected a Labour left-wing government. Thank you.
Okay. So those are the 3? Yeah, okay. First question on NATO. Yes, I did a lot of work on this question, which is one of the ironies. I think this is going to change just by the force of the tectonic plates moving. But when I was arguing essentially the same thing that a lot of the Trump people was, that the Europeans needed to do more and that they needed to rebuild their military industrial base. They should not exclude American companies. By the way, they almost definitely, because of the politics, will exclude American arms companies now, which is a tragedy because we make the best military equipment in the world, and they don't. I kept arguing that we needed to do this, and you know who was the biggest resistance to that? NATO. The NATO bureaucracy just was totally threatened by the notion that the Europeans would begin to do things on their own, build their own military equipment, maybe build their own military capability. And we always argued, well, we would do it consistent with the NATO because these countries are both in NATO and the EU. Why would they? And it became a hugely territorial issue within NATO. That's going to change. It has to change because the EU is clearly going to go in the direction of building their own military capability, and they should. We can't expect, as I used to say to politicians from the United States that came in here, show up at our, in Brussels and tell them they need to do more, and when they say, well, we want to build some of it here, say, no, you have to only buy American military equipment. That's not going to work. Converse, also not true. On debt financing, I think there will be debt financing for the first time. If there's not, the European Union will fail. They just don't have the cash. They don't get enough cash to do that. They're going to have to debt finance. But I do think if they don't, what's going to happen is they'll put all their money into defense and not anything into services, and the institutions in these member states will get weaker. Because the fact is, if you haven't seen it, there's an excellent piece on what's really going on in Romania, is that Romanians, there's a great piece in Politico, we can, Clemens and I can get it for you, about why Romanians are unhappy. And that is because since the revolution in '89, healthcare is worse, education is worse, there's a lot of US investment, by the way, a lot of Austrian investment in Romania, which is good. But people are unhappy because the services they're getting are poorer than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago. And if they spend all their money on defense, it's going to get even worse. So that's a big concern. Role of the UK. By the way, I think the current Prime Minister has been great. He's been very supportive of Ukraine. And, they have the Brits have a serious military. I mean, and they are well trained, and they were very active in Afghanistan. It's not like they're a military on paper. They actually have tremendous deep capability. I think Brexit was, by the way, as a national decision, one of the worst decisions any country has made in the last 50 years, and particularly the United Kingdom. But it's found a way to reassert itself within the European community, especially within NATO. And I'm very hopeful about what the role the UK will play.
Well, I am so pleased that we got this hour spent together. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here. Thank you for being our diplomat in residence at Nanovic. Please join me in thanking the Ambassador for his time.